They stopped listening to me years ago. My advice became background noise, my presence, a footnote. No arguments, no shouting matches, just quiet distance. So how did I regain their respect? Not with speeches, not with demands, stay with me. Because the answer is hidden in something far smaller and far quieter than you might expect. There are mornings when the tea doesn't taste like anything. Today is one of them. The light is cold through the window of my small apartment. It lands gently on the white coat hanging by the door, my old medical coat. The name stitched above the breast pocket has faded. The sleeves still carry the memory of rolled-up exhaustion, of decades spent between pediatric cribs and emergency alarms. I haven't worn it in years, but I haven't washed it either. It still hangs. I never intended to keep it this long. At first, I told myself I'd take it to the cleaners next week, then next month. Then the year ended, and still it remained, like a relic from a cathedral that had quietly closed. Every few weeks, I'd brush off the thin layer of dust that gathered on its shoulders, as if it were waiting to be called back into service, as if someone, somewhere, still needed me. But no one calls anymore. Not for second opinions, not even for recipes. I don't blame them. Sometimes I don't even blame myself. There's a certain choreography to being absent. It starts with the small excuses. I'll be home late tonight. Just one more patient. They need me, sweetheart. You understand, don't you? You say it once, then twice, then hundreds of times. Eventually, it's no longer a request. It's a rhythm, then a routine, then an identity. I used to joke that I spent more nights at the hospital than in my marriage bed. It wasn't really a joke. My husband never laughed. My children stopped waiting up by the time they were in middle school. They stopped leaving the hallway light on. That small bulb was the last to forgive me. Even when the house was asleep, it used to burn quietly like a promise I never kept. My daughter Lynn once asked if I could skip rounds on her 12th birthday. She had made a little crown from gold paper and glitter glue and waited in the hallway while I packed my briefcase. I told her I couldn't. I kissed the top of her head and said I'd be home for cake. I wasn't. That night, she left the entire cake in the fridge, untouched. It sat there for a week. Nobody threw it out. We just watched it collapse in silence. I don't remember what was so urgent that night. Maybe a newborn in respiratory distress. Maybe a post-op fever I needed to review. Maybe just inertia. The kind that convinces you someone else's emergency is more important than your child's birthday. I've held so many tiny hands in NICU cribs, but I can't remember the last time I held Lynn's. It's strange what memory keeps and what it chooses to leave behind. When people talk about sacrifice, they usually imagine something noble. I did too. I thought sacrificing my time, my sleep, my marriage, even my motherhood was part of the deal. That the children I helped survive would somehow repay the ones I didn't tuck in. That saving other people's lives was a fair trade for not fully showing up in my own. But sacrifice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it looks like eating leftovers standing up in the kitchen, or forwarding your daughter's school photos to a colleague because you forgot to pick them up yourself, or nodding during your son's story while silently reviewing a patient's chart in your head. Sometimes it's forgetting the name of your daughter's best friend, missing the first piano recital, not noticing when her voice stops being excited to see you. And sometimes it's not the things you forget, but the things they remember. They remember your absence, like a language. A silence they learned to translate early, a gap in the photo albums, a birthday where the cake stayed whole. There's no ceremony for mothers who disappear gradually, no wake, no funeral, just a quiet estrangement you only recognize in hindsight, a daughter who hesitates before hugging you, a son who calls only when something breaks. Years later, someone asked me why I didn't retire earlier. I said, because I was good at being a doctor. What I didn't say was, because I had no idea how to be a mother without prescriptions or protocol. What does love look like when it's no longer measurable? When you can't chart it, diagnose it, fix it? It looks like absence. It looks like a white coat hanging by the door, still waiting for permission to be washed. It looks like a crown of gold glitter flattened at the edges. It looks like a cake no one ate. It looks like a phone that rings less each year. But sometimes, it looks like a woman finally waking up, not to guilt, not to shame, but to the quiet possibility that it's not too late to sit at the table again. Even if no one asks, even if all she brings is tea. No one tells you the exact moment your voice stops echoing in your children's heads. But one evening, over lemongrass chicken and jasmine rice, I realized mine had. We were seated around the table. Me, Lynn, my son Dewey, their spouses, 2 grandchildren. I had cooked all morning, clinging to a half-remembered recipe from my mother, its steps more memory than method. The taste was uncertain, but the effort, I hoped, still mattered. They chatted about stocks, school admissions, airline cancellations. My granddaughter spilled juice, someone passed the fish sauce, and the world moved without me. I sat among them, not excluded, not rejected, just unneeded, like a painting hung out of obligation in a room no one enters. At one point, I reached for more rice, and my hand brushed Dewey's. He looked up, smiled, kindly, politely, and turned away. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a question, maybe a simple, "How have you been, Mom?" What I got was a flicker, a kindness that didn't reach. And that was when it settled, the knowledge that the distance between us wasn't malicious. It was just sediment. Years of absent dinners, missed parent-teacher nights, long silences I had mistaken for understanding. They had grown around the gap. They had built lives in the space where I might have been. Even the conversation topics reminded me of everything I had missed. They referenced family jokes I didn't understand, recalled a road trip to Dalat, a beach vacation in Nha Trang, places I'd only seen in their social media photos. I smiled, nodded, but the laughter felt coded, like a language I once spoke fluently, now reduced to fragments. It was Dewey's wife who asked me if I wanted more tea, not Dewey, not Lynn, a stranger who had married into my family and showed me more awareness than the ones I birthed. I shook my head, said thank you. The words felt formal, distant, the way you speak to someone else's mother. I cleared the dishes while they scooped ice cream and scrolled through their phones. No one offered help. I didn't ask. The clatter of forks on bowls filled the space where gratitude might have lived. In the kitchen, the microwave door reflected someone I half recognized. Not elderly, not youthful, just paused, as if time had forgotten to continue in my direction. The smell of lemongrass clung to my sleeves. I held the edge of the counter longer than necessary, unsure what to do next. Something in me wanted to scream. Another part, the larger one, simply wanted to sleep. After they left, I stood by the front door, fingertips brushing the coat still hanging there. My white coat, my shield, my passport to purpose. It hadn't been worn in years, but I couldn't wash it. Not because of laziness, but because I was afraid that if I did, I'd wash away the last proof that I had once been needed. I sat in the living room. The television buzzed faintly with a rerun I didn't follow. Their voices still echoed in the silence, but now they sounded like guests, not family. The light over the kitchen table buzzed, flickering slightly. I watched it for what felt like hours. That old bulb had been there since my husband passed, maybe longer. Its hum felt more familiar than my children's voices. I thought about how Lynn's eyes glazed over when I told her a story from the hospital, about a child I had resuscitated, about a father who had cried into my coat sleeve. She nodded, said, "That's nice." But she wasn't with me. Not really. There was a time she used to listen with wide eyes, ask questions. "Did the baby live, Mom? Was the father happy?" Now, she only looked at her watch. The next morning, I took out a letter I had started months ago. A letter to Lynn. It began, "I want to explain, but I don't know if it matters anymore." I reread the line 3 times, then folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope. Some things don't need rewriting. They just need witnessing, and maybe that's what happened that night. Because as I rinsed the last plate, Lynn came back into the kitchen. She didn't say much. She just stood beside me, dried each dish I handed her. Not a word, not an apology. But she stayed, she stayed. And for the first time in a long while, I let that be enough. I didn't ask her to talk. I didn't break the silence. I let the stillness between us be honest, unedited. She passed me a clean bowl. I passed her a spoon. And somewhere in that quiet choreography, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not closeness, but proximity. And maybe, just maybe, that's the first step home. There are freedoms so small you don't realize you've lost them until you try to reclaim them. Like choosing when to eat, or what to wear, or how long to sit on a park bench without someone wondering if you're okay. In my working years, freedom was paradoxical. I had the freedom to save lives, but not to take a nap. I could command a surgical team, but couldn't decide when to go home. But the loss that crept up on me wasn't the schedule. It was the loss of spontaneity. After retirement, I thought I would finally be free. Free to travel, free to paint, free to call my daughter in the middle of the day just to hear her voice. But I didn't, because something inside me had curled in on itself. Not fear, not shame, just a sense that I no longer had the right to intrude. I began to live quietly, invisibly. I drank my morning tea at the same time every day. I read the same books over and over. The comfort of repetition replaced the chaos of a hospital ward, but also dulled the urgency of being. Then one day, a neighbor named Mrs. Ann invited me to her balcony garden. Nothing dramatic, just two women pruning herbs and swapping complaints about squirrels. But something shifted that day, because for the first time in months, I laughed. A short, startled kind of laugh, the kind that escapes before you remember how to hold it back. And that night, I pulled out my sketchbook, the one I had tucked away after my husband passed. I didn't draw well, but I drew a window, a teacup, a pair of gardening shears, tiny, ordinary things. But in that moment, they were mine. The next morning, I walked to the bookstore. I hadn't gone in years. I told myself it was because of my knees. But the truth was, I didn't know who I was without my ID badge, without being Dr. Tran. But that day, I walked slowly, not like someone with nowhere to be, but like someone learning that having nowhere to be is also a kind of luxury. Inside the bookstore, I bought a journal. Not for medical notes, not for patient observations, just for me. Later that week, Dewey called. He asked if I could babysit Saturday. I almost said yes out of reflex, but something in me hesitated. "I can't this weekend," I said gently. "I have plans." There was silence on the line. Then he said, "Oh, okay, Mom." It was the first time I had chosen myself over being needed, and nothing crumbled. The world kept spinning. He didn't argue. He respected it. That evening, I sat on my balcony with a cup of chrysanthemum tea and sketched the sky turning gold. No one needed me, and I wasn't lonely, because for the first time in a long time, I was choosing, not reacting, existing, not just enduring. I used to think being a mother meant giving everything, but now I wonder if my children ever truly knew who I was. Maybe they still don't, but I'm beginning to remember, and that might be the most sacred freedom of all. No one warned me that healing might feel like rebellion. It began subtly, a shift in posture, a pause before I said yes, a breath held longer than usual. But these moments stacked like stones across a stream, bridges I didn't know I was building. One evening, Lynn called. She wanted to come by, but asked if I could make that soup she liked, the one I always made without complaint. I hesitated. Then I said, "I'd love to see you, but maybe this time you bring the soup." Silence. Not cold, just surprised. She agreed, and when she arrived, carrying a small plastic container, unsure of her own recipe, I smiled. I thanked her like I meant it, because I did. This was not defiance. It was not punishment. It was participation, a new choreography, a new kind of love. But resistance doesn't always look like saying no. Sometimes it looks like not explaining yourself. I used to feel obligated to narrate every choice. I'm tired. I had a long day. It's not that I don't want to. I just can't. Now I've begun to speak in full stops instead of commas. No more padding, no more apologies for needing space. When Dewey asked why I didn't come to his last housewarming, I told him simply, I needed rest. He blinked, waited for more, but I didn't add anything. And the world did not collapse. These are the victories no one sees. The dinner you don't cook, the party you don't attend, the request you decline, not from spite, but from softness, from truth. And slowly, very slowly, they begin to adjust. They begin to see you not as a fixture, but as a person. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors. And for the first time, I was learning how to install locks without guilt. It happened the day Lynn called about her son's school fundraiser. She needed help organizing, printing, delivering. The old me would have cleared my day. The new me paused. I think this is something you'll do beautifully, I said. Her voice faltered. But you always help. I used to, I said. And now I want to cheer you on from here. That evening I watched the sun disappear behind the apartment rooftops, and for once, I didn't feel like I had let anyone down. Because I was learning something the hospital never taught me. Caring doesn't always mean doing. Later that week, I ran into Mrs. Ann again. She handed me a jar of pickled vegetables and said, You look taller somehow. I laughed. I'm shrinking, actually. She shook her head. No, you're standing up straighter. And I thought, maybe that's what boundaries do. Maybe they straighten the spine, quietly, kindly, without anyone noticing until the jar is in your hand, and you feel bigger than you were before. There is a kind of breaking that doesn't make a sound, and there is a kind of pain that doesn't ask for permission to arrive. It happened on a Tuesday. The morning had been almost beautiful. Tea in my favorite ceramic cup, the one with the chipped rim that still fit my hand perfectly. A short walk to the postbox, passing the elderly couple downstairs who always waved without knowing my name. A crossword puzzle half finished, with the clue for 17 across still teasing me. The word was irrelevant. Then came the call. My sister, from California. I saw Lynn's post, she said, about her new promotion. I smiled before I understood. Oh, I replied, fingers curling slightly tighter around the phone. She didn't mention it. She said it's been in the works for months. Senior Strategy Officer, that's a big title. I said she deserves it, she's always been brilliant. But what filled the silence after that wasn't pride. It was something colder, something older, a familiar weight pressing behind my ribs like damp cotton. When the call ended, I stayed seated for a long while, not moving, not thinking, just letting the air settle around me like dust. I didn't call Lynn. I didn't congratulate her. Not because I wasn't proud. God, I was. But because I didn't know how to reach for her without touching the old wound. Instead, I went to my bedroom. The light was dim. The curtains swayed slightly in the late afternoon breeze, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the same spot where, years ago, I held Dewey against my chest while he coughed through his first winter flu. I remembered where I used to keep cough syrup, where I stored extra thermometers, the way I would rest my hand against their foreheads and murmur, I've got you. When was the last time I said that and meant it? Now I sat there holding not a child, but a question. When did she stop telling me things that mattered? Maybe it wasn't deliberate. Maybe it was just what happens when trust erodes slowly, imperceptibly, like paint fading under sunlight. You don't notice until one day you wake up and realize the wall is bare. I reached for my journal that night. I thought writing would help, but the page looked back at me like a mirror I didn't want to stand in front of. I wrote a single line. She doesn't need me anymore. Then another. Maybe she never did. Maybe I only imagined she did. And I stopped, because even if it wasn't true, it was how I felt, and that hurt more than I had expected. Collapse doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like silence, like unanswered messages, like being thanked too formally, like learning about your daughter's life through a social media caption instead of a phone call. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I cleaned. I wiped surfaces already clean. I rearranged spices I no longer used. I found a pair of Lynn's old socks, tiny, pink, with dancing cats on them, and I sat on the floor, holding them like relics. That evening, I opened the refrigerator. The light flickered as it always did. Inside, a few vegetables beginning to wilt, a nearly empty carton of milk, a tub of yogurt long past its date, and a bowl of soup, unopened. It was the same soup Lynn had brought a week ago, when I told her to bring the meal instead of me making it. She had come in, flustered but trying, carrying it like an apology wrapped in plastic. "I hope it's still hot," she'd said. I had nodded, smiled, but I never ate it. I had told myself I wasn't hungry. The truth was, I didn't know how to receive something without repaying it immediately, so it sat there, quietly accusing me every time I opened the fridge. Now, it sat between 2 dying cucumbers and a bottle of soy sauce with a crusted lid. I closed the fridge and slid to the kitchen floor. The tiles were cold against my knees. I pulled the soup into my lap, held it with both hands, and wept. Not for the soup, not for the promotion, not even for being left out. I cried for the woman I had become, for the distance between who I had been and who I had hoped to be, for the mother who always showed up with folded uniforms and midnight soup, but not always with listening ears, and for the child who had learned to stop asking. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour, maybe just long enough to be honest with myself. I did not reach for forgiveness. I did not reach for the phone. I did not try to fix it. I just cried, then breathed. And when I had no more tears left, I rose, heated the soup, and sat at the table, alone, but not invisible. And I ate, and for once, it was enough. I first noticed him on my 4th visit to the garden. Ellery Gates, room 217, a former civil engineer who wore socks with tiny compasses on them and had the steady, unfazed gaze of someone who'd watched buildings fall and still found reasons to build. We didn't talk much in those early weeks. He'd sit under the wisteria tree near the bench I liked, always with the same green notebook, always drawing lines in silence, no paragraphs, just lines. Long ones, short ones, parallel, intersecting, as if he were mapping something no one else could see. One afternoon, I asked what he was sketching. He looked up, blinked slowly, and said, "The things that didn't collapse," then went back to drawing. It wasn't until much later, after we'd become regulars in each other's silences, that I heard him speak more than a sentence. "I used to design bridges," he said one day, out of nowhere, "ones that had to bend in the wind but not break. You'd be surprised how many people think rigidity is strength." He wasn't talking about bridges. He told me about a wife who died 5 years ago, and a son who stopped writing letters 3 years before that. "I used to think grief was a thing that happened," he said, not looking at me. "Now I think it's something we agree to carry, or not." That sentence settled between us like a slow leaf. Then he turned the page of his notebook and showed me a drawing. It was not a bridge, it was a room. Mine, my window, my orchid, even the coffee ring I had left on the table 2 days earlier. "I remember details," he said, "even when people think I don't." I didn't know what to say. He'd drawn it from memory, every line straight, deliberate. But what struck me most wasn't the room, it was the person sitting in it. Me, not bent over, not invisible, just there, still. "You're easier to draw now," he said softly. "You've stopped trying to disappear." And I wanted to laugh or cry or maybe both, because in that quiet garden, in the company of a nearly silent man and a page of pencil lines, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe. Someone had been watching. Someone had seen me, even in my silence, even when I had forgotten how to see myself. "Do you miss him?" I asked once, meaning his son. Ellery nodded. "Yes, but I think he was right to walk away. I built things that made sense. I didn't always build relationships that did." He said it like an architect explaining a structural flaw he now fully accepted. There was no self-pity in his voice, no blame, just the math of consequence. "But I remember him," he added. "I remember how he loved grape soda and hated thunderstorms, how he once built a cardboard castle in our living room and made me swear never to knock it down." He looked at me then, and I didn't, not even when he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about cardboard castles, about bridges that bend, about Ellery's green notebook filled with rooms he no longer visited but refused to forget. And I wondered, have I kept anything standing? Have my children built anything they trusted me not to knock down? I didn't know, but I knew at least that I wanted to find out. It began with a drawer, the second one on the left side of my desk, the one I hadn't opened since I moved into this apartment. Inside, I found fragments of a life I'd forgotten how to carry. A note from Lynn, scrawled in crayon, "You are the best mommy, doctor." A grocery list in my late husband's handwriting, an expired museum membership I never used, and a folded piece of paper that read, "Don't forget, 7 p.m. recital." I hadn't gone. I told myself I had an emergency that night, something to do with a premature infant and a failing lung. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. What I remembered, as I stared at the faded ink, wasn't the reason. It was the absence. The empty seat. The glance Lynn probably cast toward the door, hoping I'd still appear. I used to think forgetting was passive, that it happened because we were too tired, too overwhelmed. But now I wonder if forgetting is also a choice, a way to survive the guilt of knowing we chose the page over the person, the pager over the plea. I forgot the recital, but I remembered every abnormal heartbeat, every dosage by weight, every oxygen level that hovered too close to danger. My brain was a fortress of precision. But my heart? My heart had rooms locked from the inside. That night, I sat down at my desk, and I wrote a letter. To Lynn. Not to fix anything, not to explain, just to say, "I'm sorry for the moments I forgot to remember you." I wrote about the recital, about the cake I missed, about the bedtime stories I promised but didn't finish. I told her I don't expect forgiveness, only space, to build something again, even if we start small, even if it's made of cardboard. I placed the letter in an envelope but didn't send it. Not yet. Because what I truly needed first, before mending, before reaching, was to face the version of myself I had abandoned long before anyone else did. The woman who only knew how to be useful, the woman who mistook urgency for importance, the woman who could save a child's heartbeat, but not her own daughter's trust. I stared into the mirror for a long time that evening, not to check my reflection, but to finally witness myself without the armor of purpose, and I whispered, aloud, to no one, "You forgot who you were, but you're allowed to remember now." It was Ellery who said it first. We were in the garden again, late afternoon, the wisteria above us heavy with bloom. He'd been unusually quiet, even for him. "I think," he said, "some bridges aren't meant to be walked across." I tilted my head. "Then what are they for?" He traced a finger along the spine of his notebook. "Maybe just to remind us something can hold, even if we never cross it." I didn't respond, but the thought stayed. That night, I opened the drawer again. The envelope was still there, the one addressed to Lynn. I took it out, pressed it between my palms like prayer, and finally, placed it by the door. Not to force a response, not to demand redemption, but as an offering, a beam placed across a gap without asking if it would be stepped on. 2 days later, I opened my door to find Lynn standing there. She didn't say a word, just held up the letter, and then stepped forward into the apartment, into the silence, into whatever came next. We made tea without talking. She asked about the orchid. I asked about her new role. And then, for the first time in years, we sat without armor. She didn't say she forgave me. I didn't ask her to. But when she got up to leave, she reached for my coat, the one hanging by the door. She brushed the dust from the shoulder, hung it gently on a different hook. "Maybe it's time," she said, and I nodded. Not because I knew what came next, but because something had shifted, not erased, not repaired, but realigned. And I understood then. The last beam isn't a grand gesture. It's a quiet placement, a simple act of staying. We don't always get to rebuild the house, but sometimes we get to strengthen the frame. Sometimes we get to say, the blouse still hangs, and still, I am here. Epilogue. What still holds people? Sometimes ask me, quietly, as if it's a secret, how I found my way back to my children's respect. As if there's a map, as if I ever knew what I was doing. But there were no grand reconciliations, no tearful dinners, no cinematic closure. Healing, in my experience, moves like ivy, slow, tangled, relentless. It clings to small choices, quiet shifts, and if I had to name what held, it would be these. I stopped chasing their approval and began to restore my own sense of worth. I chose not to argue, but to live in a manner that reflected calm and dignity. I let go of needing to be needed and found meaning in my own company. I set boundaries, not as punishment, but as protection. And I gave only from a place that was no longer empty. They never named these changes, never sat me down to say they noticed. But one night, Lynn stayed longer after dinner. Dewey asked how I was sleeping, and my grandson looked at me, eyes wide, and said, "I want to hear your stories." That was enough. Respect doesn't return with declarations. It tiptoes back in moments. A glance, a shared silence, a hand brushing dust from an old coat. And sometimes you realize the room never stopped building. You just had to choose to remain inside it.